Welcome to Conspiracy Fact Press. Today we're here for another great interview with Dylan, the map maker. He is here today to explain his Cult of Baal map. How are you doing today, Dylan?
Hey, good. Good to be back.
So, Cult of Baal, would you like to explain just about the basic name and what this map overview is about? Like, it seemed to me to be mostly a map of the satanic and human sacrificing or cannibalistic different death groups that are all kind of correlated, and a map of negative history, basically.
That's pretty much exactly what it is. It is a map of, for one thing, human sacrifice. So the history of human sacrifice, but it's also a map of the elites who are occultists and practice a form of Satanism that has many different names. And so this is showing the different names throughout history, the different societies they've infiltrated, the different names of the secret societies they've created. And yeah, going all the way back to the Canaanites on this version. The earlier version, it went back to the Pharaohs, but this one goes back even further to the Canaanites.
So why don't you start there then with the Canaanites?
Well, actually, let me just maybe explain first how this kind of came to be. So it was during my research for the QWeb. When I started the QWeb, I really was mainly familiar with 20th century conspiracies. And so before I released the first version of that, I had to do a lot of research on conspiracies that happened before the 21st century, or sorry, the 20th century. So yeah, researching back into like the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and like ancient times. So when I wanted to revise the QWeb after I initially released it, and I had a lot more information that other people had given me input on, I had to do like an intensive research on this early period. And I was trying to get straight, like the main thing I was trying to track down going back to the earliest times was like how the elite in modern day society ended up with this like occult religion that is very much like Satanism, what a lot of people call it. So just tracing them back, basically tracing back, the tip of the power structure back through time, through the different religions that have been created and the different wars and the different power grabs from one group to another, to try to find like a consistent thread, basically a thread of power. It's not one society that dies and the next one just comes out of nowhere. Like what's actually happened is that the elites of that previous society have actually become the power in the next society. So, a lot of people think the pharaohs are gone, but it's basically the same people or the same, definitely bloodline, but also, the same pot of gold. They've been dipping their hands into the same pot of gold for 2,000 years.
Yeah, it seems to be that they infiltrate the next one before they burn down the last kingdom they created.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they're forced to take on a new name or move on to a different society because too many people find out about the one. And so that one gets a bad name, and then the people throw them out of power. And they just go underground for a while and come back under another name. So this research started in a different map called the Sephiroth map of the Pharaonic Death Cult, which came out in about March. And that was just basically a simplified version of the Cult of Baal. I don't know if whoever's doing the video wants to like maybe roll up and pull that one up, the Sephiroth map. It's the same structure in the middle. It's just it doesn't have any of that information in the side margins. So when I released that one, I feel like people didn't really fully get like the thesis. I mean, I kind of did an essay with it too, but they didn't really realize like how much information was actually on there, like the full extent of that timeline I was trying to show. So I'd always intended to do another version that was expanded and had all the information in the margins, for people to just jump into the margin and read about those bullet points that had originally been just in the central structure. So do you guys remember ever seeing that one in April?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was.
You just released a previous update on the QWeb too, right?
Yeah, definitely. That was when the QWeb first started having the ancient section like fully developed, the ancient and medieval section like fully developed around the time when I released the Sephiroth map.
your sidelines in, right? Your margins filled in with all the stuff that made it today's map, the cult of Baal.
Yeah, there's always been a sort of short essay that went with the Sephiroth map that you can get on, well, now it's on page 2 of the PDF. I guess there wasn't always even a PDF to go with it, but it's now, the Sephiroth map is a PDF where you can read an essay on page 2, and that's also on the Sephiroth page of my personal website. So just to sort of explain my website structure really briefly, is my main website is deepstatemappingproject.com, which you'll find the very first thing is the free downloads. And, we've got the Q web, I think the Q key, which is the color version, the Sephiroth map, the Cult of Baal map. So you can get PDFs of all of those, and the essays on page 2 of that Sephiroth map one. Now, in addition to that, if you want to dig deeper, in the info tab of the navigation bar on deepstatemappingproject.com is where you will find the other individual pages I've created for these artworks. So actually each one has their own page. There's a page for the Q web, a page for the Sephiroth map, and a page for the Cult of Baal map. And you'll find that essay again on the Sephiroth maps website. And there's also a lot of other information on there, like pictures of my development process and early versions of the artwork, like different components of the artwork. And the Cult of Baal website actually even has a bibliography, which is really new for me because, with my QWeb, everyone's asking me what my sources and stuff. And so finally for this one, I actually did give my sources. And, some of it's books, a lot of it's articles I found online, definitely some Wikipedia. And then there's a few, there's one YouTube video that I would say was almost even the inspiration for this, which I think Bibbidi was mentioning earlier, or I think that was Retango. Oh, sorry, just Tango, which was Chat Zafrat's The Pharaoh Show. Has anyone seen that one?
I think Tango's seen that.
So yeah, that's definitely, I think, an important video to watch, just because it basically is a guy in Switzerland who goes around Switzerland looking at the architecture and the symbols on the walls and the stone, and just basically pointing out how there's so much Egyptian symbolism in Switzerland. And he's really done his history homework, and he knows basically that is why that they have this Egyptian symbolism is because they are descendants from the pharaohs, and it's that power structure that started with the pharaohs that is in charge of Switzerland today, and using Switzerland as its global headquarters, and that using basically America as its what I call a pharaonic proxy army. So that's, in a nutshell, the string of connections going back to the pharaohs. I mean, we're going to go through, I think, the individual points too in between there, but that's generally the thesis of how, the pharaoh structure got to be controlling the USA today.
So Dylan, now that we can kind of break down and see with your whole map that these prior power structures, or even if you want to call it one power structure as a whole, basically kind of tampered down to each individual arm or finger, if you want to call it that. Now that we can kind of see this and understand it in a visual sense, I think it's really important at this time because you see right now the breaking away of the Catholics and the Catholic Church and what's going on inside the Catholic Church. And so we're going to have a huge population of people trying to understand what they have been suppressed. They have this information been suppressed from them forever. And so what would you do as the map maker to try to ease them into understanding this power structure as a whole, and not just blaming, what exists now, but what has existed for thousands and thousands of years?
Well, this map definitely isn't the soft way to explain it to people. Definitely people who are Catholic, because this map is kind of giving you the full disclosure in one place. And like you were saying, it's trying to show a very complicated progression of power on a, all on one piece of paper in a simple format. So sometimes when people look at this, they just understand it immediately, and it's pretty shocking to their faith, actually. Probably, I would say maybe worse so for Catholics, but maybe not worse so for Catholics if they're really stubborn, they just don't even really want to read it or read into it. But I've definitely had a few people who have looked at this and been like, wait, so like, is God real? Like, does God exist? And I'm like, well, that's not, the question I'm trying to answer with this. Like, I'm just investigating history. But, when you see that basically the Vatican is evil or like satanic at the core, the very highest level, you have to accept that that organization is at the core. And I mean, if people, obviously not everyone believes in what the highest level believe in, but if that's who's controlling them, it's like their belief system has been manipulated by these evil ones. So it does take into question, who, if their beliefs are true or not, because they have been corrupted at the core. And there might be a different interpretation of their beliefs that's true, but that's like what they'll need to seek next, as opposed to having the confirmation be through, say, the Vatican. And it kind of presents a problem for Protestants as well, because, Protestantism arose as a response to the Vatican's harshness during the Inquisition. But, the thing with Protestant is that it's sort of based on the same version of Catholicism or Christianity that Catholicism was. It didn't go back to before Catholicism and take one of these early versions of Christianity that the Vatican had exterminated. It just basically took the Vatican version of Christianity and removed the Pope and a few other parts of the power structure. So it was intended to be an improvement, but it's really sort of the same church that the Vatican started. And, but like when I was saying, going back to before the Vatican, what I was referring to was like what you would call like the Gnostics, which is like pre-Vatican Christianity, or at least a part of it. There was different sects, but the Gnostics were one of the main groups of like pre-Vatican Christians who had very different belief system than the Vatican, while they were still followers of Jesus. But then the Vatican came into power and sort of rewrote their books, or took a different selection of books. What I mean by that is basically taking out certain books like the Book of Enoch, books that they found with the Nag Hammadi scriptures in Israel in like the 1950s, were very different from the Bible, which included the Old Testament that the Vatican uses as the Christian Bible. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually, make a good point that we can take that and we can kind of put that into, whatever religious slot that we want. I mean, we could include like Jehovah's Witness. We could include all these different arms, if you will, because they're just offshoots.
Yeah. Well, and some of those offshoots, like I've heard Mormonism is even strongly linked to like Freemasonry, and like some of these offshoots are even just very directly like more evil sort of manifestations on like on a smaller scale. So one thing I just want to maybe read like maybe just like the first couple sentences from the Sephirot map essay, because it kind of there's a few important points that need to be made about this. Is that cool?
Go for it.
Absolutely, bro.
So yeah, reading from this Sephirot maps essay, which is on the back of the PDF and on the website for the Sephirot on DylanLewisMonroe.com. It's the Sephirot map follows the evolution of an occult belief system that relishes in human sacrifice and war, and uses banking as a tool for global domination. Now that's a really important point, because on sort of the second half of this map, or even really more like the last quarter of the map, the progression of power is directly linked to the moving of the biggest bank in the world. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I just want to explain that point because it's one of the most important points on here, is the banking that was developed by the Templars. Then after the Templars were defeated in the Holy Land at the end of the Crusades, they went back and founded Switzerland. Now, shortly after that, like the banking capital of the world was established in northern Italy, Florence, which is very near Switzerland. Like in those days, the border between Switzerland and Italy was always moving and was very fluid. So theoretically, those same people who had learned banking during the Crusades founded those first banks in Florence. Then the banking capital, you'll see this actually, if you're on the map, this is right to the left of the word Masons, on that node Masons in the bottom left. The banking capital of the world moved from Florence to then Hamburg, Germany, to then the Amsterdams, sorry, the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and then to London. And then way later back to Switzerland, like the main place where it had originated from with the Bank of International Settlements. That's further on the timeline. But so actually I just jumped ahead like really bad just then because I'm still trying to read like the first like 3 sentences of the introduction.
No, you're good. Go ahead. You're doing.
So jumping back to the introduction, it's really important for me to say that this is not a reinterpretation of the Kabbalah tree of life. It's designed to reference key ideas within the nodes, or it's designed to reference key ideas graphically. That's why it's the shape of the Sephirot, but it's not a reinterpretation of whatever. I'm not even a student of Kabbalah or like, you know, any other type of like New Age tree of life teachings. I just study history pretty much. And I mean, I study the religion some, but I don't get into really like learning the different religions, you know, 'cause I'm not trying to like become it. So
Right.
yeah,
You're just taking an element of some of the history and you're using it to kind of inform people like what it is actually. You're kind of using it to kind of wake people up and try to make them question like, what is this shape? What is this figure? You know what I mean? And then they kind of have to look it up and understand what it is.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, it is definitely, the Kabbalah is a really important point on here because, you know, we say the elite are satanic, but part of that is that, you know, this is one of the most important books, I think, within that belief system is the Kabbalah. And I think that they're using it for black magic, basically. And there's more to that I'll get to. But part of this satanic elite is that the Kabbalah is one of the main things that they practice and that they draw power and like occult knowledge from. So what it is, as I just said, it's not the tree of life. What it is a timeline, a very straightforward timeline that goes from early at the top to present, or not present day, but up to, well, actually close to present day at the bottom. So it's just a timeline vertically down the piece of paper. And the two nodes that are parallel to each other on the different rows are around the same time period or close. So I just wanted to show that because that's basically where my notes started. You know, I was trying to show like a timeline that was going down through times, like starting with the Canaanites and basically at the end getting to, well, I don't even get to the USA on the hand-drawn version, but, you know, getting down to the modern secret societies we have today. And then from there, I digitized that and did a little bit more refined and complex version with just text. And at that point was when I really saw, like when I was looking at that digitized version, I saw that Sephirot shape. And I was like, oh, well, isn't that convenient for me to just use that shape as the shape of the whole timeline power progression? And so that's how the Sephirot map came out, as a Sephirot. Sorry, taking a drink of water.
So what drives you? What makes you so interested in history? What piqued your interest? I mean, obviously Q, right? We all know that's why we're here to begin with. But I mean, what drives you to try to educate the masses? What's your main thing about history? What do you think it can do to impact everything?
Well, for this one, it's definitely trying to prove the point that the elite are not the religion they're claiming to be, and that the reason why the world is the way it is because we have people in charge who enjoy human sacrifice. And that satanic elite thing is one of the hardest red pills for people to swallow because, you know, everyone's heard that JFK was assassinated or that maybe like even that 9/11 was an inside job. But for a lot of people, just like even the notion that our elites could be lying about their religion is like, no, that's impossible. No. So that's really like was the main point of proving like how a religion, like an evil religion, could have gotten infiltrated into the highest level today.
Well, we've seen, you know, Barack Obama or Barry Soetoro have trouble keeping his religion straight on camera, where we know he's a Muslim, and wears a ring that talks about Allah, but that he's been
Yeah, definitely. And Islam definitely ties into all of this like very strongly. And actually, what I was going to say before, it's funny you brought up Barry Soetoro or Barack Obama because, one of my friends who's like halfway into conspiracies and knows about a few things, like I was talking to her on the phone and trying to explain like the full picture to her and like trying to bring her up to speed on some of this, and she was just like, "No, Obama's a nice guy. Like he would never, like he can't be satanic," and like saying the same thing about Beyonce. And I was just like, sorry to break it to you, like got to finish this map and then you'll understand. But yeah, it's like, a lot of these people who are actually Satanists or evil are actors, and so that's their job, to sort of deceive you. And it includes the politicians, hopefully not Trump. Yeah, so this map will really show you the whole progression and like how it's possible that evil could have gotten this far, and giving you examples all throughout history of this human sacrifice that's really completely unnecessary in our society. It's really like a scourge on our society. I was just listening to Ivanka Trump speak today about human trafficking and how it's like a scourge on the modern world and it's bad, and it really is. And what she's talking about with this human trafficking is what's going on behind the scenes here, the secret human sacrifices that are going on, both human sacrifices and just human trafficking for sexual stuff. But she's definitely referring to this going on behind the scenes, and so that was cool to see her give a speech about that just today.
Yeah, we absolutely see that, and we absolutely do know that here at conspiracyfact.press. But we can also see around the world that the squeeze is on, that these networks are getting shut down, these rat lines are getting figured out and found out by authorities, and we can see that it's happening. That there is a kibosh getting put on all of these human sacrifice rings and all these evil networks going on around the globe.
Yeah, amen. And I mean, it would seem that Trump is responsible for that. So I really think he's sort of an antidote to this old power system. But I think this is the time when for people to understand what has happened and really understand the full history. That's the important history that's relevant to the world today and relevant to the power structure, not, what we learned in high school, which was that America is just always the savior. In World War II and the Civil War, like we're always on the right. So I think, should we like maybe look at the Cult of Baal map, and I'll sort of tell you guys the basics on like how to explore it, how to read it. I mean, I've already told you it's a timeline, but there's just a couple of things that necessitate a little explanation. So the first thing to see on here is at the very top of that Sephiroth shape, those two sort of platforms that stick out of it. I'm not even really sure what they are. They're kind of like little horns, but they're kind of like Greek platforms, landing platforms maybe, of these Sumerian gods that landed and gave us this religion. So you've got on the left Baal worship and on the right human sacrifice. And so that's sort of the core of this, the cult of Baal. And actually on the Sephiroth version of this, it said Baal worship and cannibalism. And the reason why it was that specifically was because when you take the word Canaanites and add on Baal worship, or just Baal, you get the word cannibal. And that's how the word cannibal came from. And it's because some of these Canaanites, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them were cannibals. Actually, while we're on that, note, a very important disclaimer for this entire map is that, let's see, let me find the line where I explained it best. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that each of these groups has mostly good people in it. It's just this elite, the top, I would say 1%, maybe even like 1% of the 1% that are guiding this whole thing. And it's the same way they're guiding the entire population. So obviously, there's good people in all these organizations. And it's really just actually the leaders, maybe not even the only leaders, but the leaders who manage to stay in power that are the evil ones that are practicing this human sacrifice and that are like really into the Baal worship. So is that clear that, I'm not like insinuating that for especially like the Masons really take offense to this because they're like, well, we don't worship Lucifer because I have the Luciferian caption on there. But their leader or one of their most famous authors of the Freemasons, Albert Pike, did write that they worship Lucifer at the 33rd degree. So that's like, a very small percentage of Masons. And I think that's the 33rd degree of only the Scottish Rite as well. So any Blue Lodge Masons like never going to hear about this Luciferianism, and any I'm not sure about this, but probably not even Yorkish Rite. I think it's really only the Scottish Rite that was the branch of Freemasonry that was infiltrated by this power structure. So just understand that there's more research to do to figure out like which of these people were infiltrated. Like sometimes it's written here, like, but it's not always completely clear. And I don't want it to seem like I'm saying everyone in this whole society was like a Baal worshiper or like a Satanist. So hopefully that's clear.
Definitely. We know most of these people are good people, especially through, Masons. They're just people there looking for a kind of brotherhood or something like that.
Definitely. So the important thing to know about how to read this map is that you basically take one of those words from the central structure, from the central Sephiroth, whether it's inside a circle or whether it's in a connection or whether it's one of the words outside the circle, the big words. And then you go to the side that it corresponds to. So if it's on the left, you go to the left. If it's on the right, you go to the right. If it's in the center, you might have to go a little bit on both sides, or it might be more of one or the other. But the central points, I just had to basically pick a side that made more sense. But so you go to the side, and then you'll find the same word written in a bold font. And depending on which version of this you're looking at, the bold fonts may be more or less noticeable, but when you really get up close, you can really tell the difference between the bold and the normal font. And they're all bold in the same size as well, that are the terms that correspond to the main structure. So what you would do is you find a term you want to find on the main structure, then you go to the side and you find the bold term, and then around the bold term is what I've written about the main term. And so you'll find like a little bit of description. It's actually even a little bit more descriptive than the QWeb at times. I do get into some, kind of like mini sentences, but I just basically try to give you like the most important points that I've researched about that term that I can think of. And also there are a few other terms in those side margins that maybe not necessarily directly related to the term on the center, but is an important point in terms of the timeline. And I mean, it is related in some way to the term on the center. But there's definitely gets into even more explanation and historical bullet points than just like the terms on the center. And you'll probably, like, once you look through like a section, you'll probably be able to understand like how it's related, how everything's related. So yeah, just, so the first term up there at the top is Canaanites. I'm just going to get into a little, like what I would like to do. I'm not sure how we are on time, but like what I would like to do is just kind of go briefly over each of the terms on the main structure, and then let's say like the most important connections or the most important points between them, the strongest maybe.
Drop some knowledge, bro.
So the Canaanites, the most important thing here is that the early Canaanites were the Sumerians. You see that on the right, and the later Canaanites were the Phoenicians. So actually, a lot of the terms on this chart are kind of confusing about like, is this a society? Is this a people? Is this a geographic region? And for the Canaanites, I think that term actually comes from the Bible, but it mainly refers to a geographic region. So we're talking about kind of Israel and like the Middle East. You could in the early days you could call those all Canaanites. And so that's why it's saying like to the right, Canaanites were considered Sumerians very, very early on by historians, let's say. And so that's connected with the whole like Sumerian pantheon, which I'm sure a lot of people nowadays have heard of actually some of these Sumerian gods like Enki and Enlil. So like the theme kind of throughout this whole chart is that basically all religions trace back to these original Sumerian gods, Enki and Enlil, and like their whole pantheon from that Sumerian period. And I think even you can pretty much compare Baal to Enlil, because Enlil was sort of the more like warish storm one, and that's sort of what developed as Baal. I think that the name Baal actually developed a little bit later than the Sumerians, but Baal is basically would be comparable to Enlil from the Sumerians. So then, I guess from Sumerian culture, you go through Egyptian culture, and then the later Sumerians you could call Phoenicians. Phoenicians refers to a civilization that basically lived around the rim of the Mediterranean, and there was a seafaring people. So that can be kind of confusing. I mean, it was confusing to me because I pretty much knew who Sumerians were. I knew like they lived in Mesopotamia, like really a long time ago. And I pretty much knew who Egyptians were because they, obviously lived in Egypt, and they have all those landmarks, the pyramids that you can recognize as that's where their culture was. The Phoenicians are kind of confusing because they were more of a seafaring people, and their culture was spread over the whole rim of the Mediterranean, which is all different countries now. So it's really a region that you have to see on a map that's specifically drawn, because now it's all completely divided up into different countries, and it's kind of hard to think of one culture just being scattered cities around that whole ring. But they sort of just ruled the sea and were the Mediterranean people, and they were the first ones who really, well, maybe not the first ones, but their culture was really centered on the worship of Baal. And for them, they had a little bit of a different name for him, which was Baal Hamon. And that's actually even after a lot of this Egyptian history, but the timeline, it jumps a little bit to get the definitions in the right place to refer to Canaanites. They were originally Sumerians, and then there's a lot of cultures that went through that region, to be honest. I mean, this is quite a big summary, but in the late period of the Egyptians, they were called the Phoenicians from this region and in the sea and around the Mediterranean. So that's who the Canaanites were. Tribe of Dan, a lot of people say that the Antichrist will be coming from the tribe of Dan. I'm still a little bit unclear on exactly like if you could call these people the tribe of Dan, or is tribe of Dan basically says like the evil portion of God's people, of like the Israelites, of like the lost ones. What have I written here? So I see tribe of Dan, I jump to the bull, tribe of Dan. It says pagan tribe of the Antichrist, and the Bible says that they were into like the golden calf worshiping, which in Exodus, you might remember, like while Moses is taking the 10 Commandments, his people, the Hebrews, supposedly down at the bottom of the hill start worshiping the golden calf again, because they get a little bit confused about who their God is, and they start reverting back to their original ways of worshiping a golden calf, which is a reference to Baalism. But so that's what you can think of as the tribe of Dan. So what gets a little bit confusing on this map, which is why I made it to explain this, is that there's names and terminology that all come out of the Bible, and that's kind of what Canaanites, tribe of Dan, King Solomon is from. And then there's a whole different set of names that come out of mainstream historians. So that's why I'm saying, Canaanites are actually Sumerians and Phoenicians. King Solomon we'll get to. A tribe of Dan, I don't think there's really a term for that from like mainstream historians, but I think I've explained it to you guys like pretty decently. So are you guys ready for the next row?
Let's do it, bro.
So pharaohs. In Egyptian mythology, the first pharaoh is Osiris. Now this kind of contradicts mainstream historians, say pretty much the first pharaoh was Menes. That's neither here nor there, but pretty much, so Osiris was actually like a god in Egyptian mythology, and they consider him to be the first pharaoh, even though it's, at least mainstream historians have not like admitted that Osiris was a historical pharaoh or not, but that's what their belief system was. And the legends of Osiris are pretty much analogous to the legends of Nimrod in the Bible. And then the legends of Nimrod in the Bible are somewhat analogous to Gilgamesh in the Sumerian mythology. So, like I said, like there's going to be a theme on here of everything like tying back to Sumerian mythology. Even the biblical stories have parallels in Sumerian mythology, and that's like the oldest religion. And I mean, maybe this actually should have been called the cult of Enlil, but for some reason, like that Baal seems to be more appropriate than Enlil, because I'm not even sure if Enlil to Baal is like a really direct connection. Because, you know, some of these gods have very similar traits, but they also have some different traits. And basically they follow a similar archetype. And so you'll have an archetype of, say, a storm god that goes just from one culture to the next. And so that's why the names are analogous, because they're all the storm god. But then in one culture, it might be the god of storm and war. And another culture, it might be the god of, say, I don't know, well, storm and just storm, or storm and desert, actually. So an important note about the pharaohs, since we're here. Actually, you know what? Let me just break for 1 second. I think I'm jumping ahead too much before I really explained overall the map. Is that okay? Sorry to switch gears, but I just want to jump down to explain like the deity chart really quick, because I kind of just...
You're great.
Going down one avenue, like a Christianity avenue or a Greek god belief. You're going down, you know, to the root, the basic structure of it all.
Exactly. Yeah. I just wanted to jump ahead, like break off the timeline really quick and just tell you briefly that at the bottom of the diagram is what we call the deity chart. And it's sort of separate from that layout I was explaining of the terms in the middle corresponding to the margins. So the deity chart is at the very bottom. And I think if Bibbidi wants to pull up that like long horizontal picture that I posted below the black and white picture, it's a close-up of the deity chart from the poster version, which is actually a little more expanded and thorough and makes more sense than the one on the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper or JPEG.
I'm looking for it and looking for it. I'm not seeing it.
It was the last one I posted in the string of like the main images I posted for this. It's like the hand-drawn, the black and red Sephiroth, the black and white cult of Baal, and then this long sort of gray.
Yep, I finally got to it.
Yeah, so that's the deity chart. And what I came to with this is that there's basically a male archetype of this storm god, and there's like a female archetype of, I don't want to say necessarily his wife, but like I'd say like the main female goddess of the culture. And so it basically, for the female, it goes through like Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, Aphrodite, Venus, and then that corresponds to Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. And then on the other side, the masculine deity, it says Baal, Moloch, Set, Zeus, Jupiter. And actually, Zeus and Jupiter could also, you could consider that to be Saturn and Cronus. I'm not sure what makes more sense to put in that row, but it's the chief masculine deity and the storm deity of all those cultures. But then a lot of people more like, you know, Greek and Roman cultures had so many gods that I think these roles like a little bit overlapped. And so you could also tie Cronus instead of Zeus and Saturn instead of Jupiter as this chief, sort of the one that connects back to the archetype of like the Satan archetype. So back to the female side, the reason why that says Lucifer is because Venus is considered the morning star, and Lucifer is also said in the Bible to be the morning star, which corresponds to Venus. So a lot of people, you know, visualize Lucifer as a masculine deity, but it actually falls into the archetype of the feminine deity for a number of reasons. Whereas Satan corresponds to the masculine deities, like it connects back to Baal, Moloch, Set. I think, you know, even the name Set, well, the name Set has been confirmed to correspond with Satan for one thing, because Michael Aquino, that military psyops dude in the 1970s, started the Temple of Set as like a form of Satanism. So right there, you can understand that Set, this Egyptian god Set, is the one that corresponds to Satan, because like that was definitely like a satanic temple. Like Temple of Set was basically like another arm of the Church of Satan, which Anton LaVey founded in the 60s. You guys heard of him?
ODO. The OTO, right?
Oh, OTO is another sort of like satanic secret society. Yeah. I think they were probably both members, right? Probably. I know, oh, never mind. But yeah, Set corresponds to Satan, like for sure. And so, yeah, I don't want to get into deity chart too much right now, but just to know that that's a different section down there. And then you have to the upper right of that, like the legend of the diagram, which just tells you like the little symbols, like what they mean. And I have a little cross, which stands for human sacrifice, like a little, I think it's like a 9-pointed star that stands for a capital. That means a capital city. Usually the capital city of whatever society you're looking in the section of. Now, the next one is if you see two terms that have a line in between them, like one on top of the other, that means that it's two terms for the same thing, or that they were the same people that have two different names, or that they're the same people that existed in two different locations. Then I have a little kind of like lightning bolt that represents a storm god. And then I have just like obviously like a line with the two little balls on the end represents a connection. And then there's a couple little question marks on here that represent theories or stuff that I'm not sure about, or stuff, I mean, probably no one's completely sure about, but there's a few different theories on here that, you know, I don't want to presume to anything, or just, you know, so there's a few things that you could consider theory. Now, shall we go back up to pharaohs and continue the timeline? All right. So pharaohs existed around the same time as Babylon, and these kings of Babylon. It's sort of at the top of this diagram, like the left column sort of represents the west, and the right column sort of represents the east. There's another. It's like kind of geographically divided like that. Not so much further down. Like once you get to the Masons and the Jesuits, there's not like a geographic divide there, but at the top, it's a little bit of like a west and east situation in terms of the timeline. So Babylon is actually the new node that I added after the Sephiroth map. The Sephiroth map ended in pharaohs at the top because I was trying to prove that Chat Sephiroth's Pharaoh Show video thesis that this all goes back to the pharaohs. And, you know, I still think that thesis is true, but there's also a strong influence that came into this cult of Baal, or this, you know, the cult that runs the world, from Babylon. And I think that the leaders of those societies have kind of merged and like decide to work together to take over humanity pretty much. And both of them go back to the Canaanites, because that's just, I mean, Canaanites is sort of a general term for like the earliest culture in that region. And it definitely, there was people in that region before like the main Egyptian dynasties that we track as like Egyptian history. And Canaanites would include Babylon. So it's just sort of like the early Babylonians. Like I said, like the Canaanites are early Sumerians, later Phoenicians. All right, so Dank, you were asking about the Hyksos, right?
Yes, of course.
So the Hyksos was the 15th dynasty in Egypt, and they're considered foreign rulers. They were foreign invaders of Egypt. They were a tribe, I guess you could call it, that came in from the Canaanite region and took over northern Egypt and started their own dynasties. And they lasted for, you know, maybe a few hundred years, but then they were driven out. And some theorists say that the Hyksos are actually the Hebrews. So that's why you see on the right there Hebrews above the line Hyksos. So like basically both the theories that are reconciling biblical history with historical history, both of the theories basically place the Hebrews as being Egyptian dynasties, not just being Egyptian slaves. And so that would be one part of the theory, saying that the Hebrews came from the Hyksos. Then the other part of that theory is saying that the Hebrews came from the 21st dynasty, which is the dynasty formed by the priests of the temple. They weren't like a pharaoh bloodline. They were the priests of the temple that abandoned the pharaoh and the pharaonic bloodline and formed their own dynasty, which was the 21st dynasty. And so the reason why people believe that is because there's a lot of parallels between this 21st dynasty of Egypt and the Hebrew or Jewish stories of the United Kingdom of Israel, which was what the Bible says is that after Exodus happened, like the slaves left Egypt, Exodus, and then they fought some wars to establish themselves in the Israel region, and then they went into this thing, the United Monarchy, which was the 12 tribes becoming one kingdom under these kings' names, which you've probably heard, like King David, King Solomon. I think King Saul was before King David, maybe. I'm a little need to brush up on that. 1 second. Let me swig this water. But yeah, so the 21st dynasty has a lot of parallels to this United Monarchy of Israel. And you know what? Let me pull up the name of this book, because I found one, I was really trying to figure this out for myself. And so I was doing research on different places, and I finally found one guy who had written some really good books about that, basically figuring out who these biblical kings really were in the historical record. Because part of the problem with King Solomon and this story about a united Israel and these biblical kings is that there are 0 artifacts. And there's like one artifact that's like a shard of rock with cuneiform on it that scholars say has the word King Solomon on it. But for one thing, you're taking a scholar's word for it, that they translated it from just anything. And for two, it's a little bit odd that that's like the only physical record of what would have been King Solomon's temple, because King Solomon basically built the first temple of the Jewish religion, or like the first central, maybe like main one. Maybe they had like little houses or something before that they practiced in, but he's recognized as having built like the first temple. And it's weird that we haven't found like much historical evidence of it. I mean, people say like they're digging all around like Temple Mount, because that's where it's supposed to be according to the Bible. They're digging all around there, like trying to find stuff, and then saying that like the Muslims are impeding like their digging efforts, and that they're just being sabotaged by the Muslims. But there's evidence that that's where the second temple was, but because the Romans had documented that. But there's really no evidence of that having ever had like a first temple other than stories. So some, like the author of this book that I found, let me pull up his name. It's I still can't find the author's name. It's on my Amazon, but I don't want to take it too long. Maybe we can link it in the description of the video. But yeah, his theory was that this 21st dynasty of Egypt, which had its capital, like this is the priest that left the main Egypt, which was down at the Temple of Karnak, which is the city of Luxor. They left the Egyptian pharaohs and started their own dynasty in a city called Tanis. Now, the interesting thing about Tanis is that it's way in northern Israel. I would even say like northeast Israel, basically like as close to, or sorry, not Israel, Egypt. It's in northeast Egypt, as close to Israel as you can get. So geographically, you can kind of see how maybe like these two got confused, because it was, in that they were both sort of in the same region. So that's one theory, is that the original King Solomon's temple was a temple in Tanis run by the 21st Egyptian dynasty. That's one theory. And from the research I've done, that's like the best I could come up with in terms of like really figuring it out. But yeah, that's up, it still could use a little more research. So then it's clear that, well, in biblical history, and I think there's also a physical record, that Nebuchadnezzar from the Babylonians conquered that whole region, whether they were Egyptians or whether they were Hebrew, Israelis. Nebuchadnezzar conquered that whole region. And then in the Bible, that's what's referred to as the Babylonian captivity, when the original Hebrews were supposedly taken to Babylon and kept in captivity, and the temple of King Solomon was destroyed. By the way, just like a preface, King Solomon is definitely important to all of this, because that's who the Freemasons base all of their lodges off of. So I didn't just pick King Solomon out of a hat as like, this is the most important guy to put on here. Like, I know he's important because the Freemasons consider him so important. And so that's part of the reason why I did so much investigating into King Solomon specifically, was because every Masonic temple is based on Solomon's temple. So, and like their two pillars have symbolic meaning based on King Solomon. So that's why I was really digging into King Solomon so hard, because I was like, why are the Freemasons like obsessed with him? And it actually kind of makes sense that if he was actually one of these Egyptian pharaohs, because also in Freemasonry, you see this like obsession with ancient Egypt. And, if the Hebrews had escaped their oppressors, the Egyptians, and then, gone on and evolved into Christianity, and then gone and evolved into the Freemasons, why would you want to be putting like your oppressors, like if like your slave masters symbols like all over your own like decorations and lodges or whatever? So that's why I was really digging into, like, you see the pyramid on the dollar bill. So it's like, why are we like still obsessed with the Egyptians when they were supposedly just like slave masters to us? And it's because they weren't just like these elites were the Egyptians. They didn't escape from the Egyptians. Like, that's part of this whole it's part of this victim story that lets them get away with what they're doing, is that, it starts off with the story of the Hebrews escaping from a slave master, the Egyptians. So automatically you feel like these people deserve to be treated nicely, because they were slaves and they escaped. And so, you want good things for them. But like, it seems that the truth is that they were really just a dynasty, or multiple dynasties, possibly the Hyksos and the 21st dynasty, the priests of Karnak, which both those dynasties failed and were driven out of Egypt, or were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. So it just gives you a very different perspective of history, that, we didn't come from the underdog. We came from like the attack dog. You get what I'm saying?
100% the conquerors.
Yeah, like, I mean, the Hyksos were the invaders, not well, nobody says that the Hyksos weren't the invaders, but definitely like the Hebrews aren't considered to be the invaders. But then, so the working theory, I just want to say again, the working theory that I have now at this point is that the Hebrews were composed of, first of all, the Hyksos who left Egypt after they invaded, and then later were joined by, or maybe were conquered by, these Karnak priests that formed the 21st dynasty, and then all of them were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, while these supposed Hebrews were in Babylonian captivity in Babylon, the temple of King Solomon had been destroyed. This is in the year 600 BC or 589 is when they were conquered. So keep in mind, a lot of them are illiterate. There's probably only a handful of copies of the actual scriptures. So if their temple is obliterated, it's unclear if even the scriptures would have made it to Babylon, especially if they were under like a religious persecution as well. So the Bible says that a copy, I think, did make it to Babylon, that it was held by Ezra, who was one of the last priests, or what would you call a Jewish priest?
Rabbi?
Yeah, one of the last rabbis of King Solomon's temple before it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So supposedly Ezra took the Torah to Babylon, and then either rewrote it, or maybe he actually rewrote it in Babylon from memory. I'm not sure exactly what the Bible says that happened, but either he had like the last remaining copy, or he rewrote it from memory. So that brings up the question of whether whether Ezra was like a spy working for this Babylonian king that he just wanted him to like create a religion for these Canaanites and then bring it back to Israel or the Canaanite region and say, you know, we were your relatives, like this was your religion and we're back to save you, basically. I wondered that when I was doing this. I was like, if he did this from like, if he came up with this whole Torah from memory, like who's to say that he was even like one of the original Hebrews that left? So that's an interesting theory, because then we're getting back to the return of the Jews. So Cyrus the Great was the, I guess you would call, king of the Babylonians at the time when the Jews were allowed to return back to Zion, which is the Israel area. And that's when you begin the Judea Second Temple period. So basically what this chart is saying is that it's not completely clear that united Israel monarchy really existed as it's portrayed in the Bible, but that it may have actually been either like the 21st dynasty of Egypt or Hyksos people, like sort of like failed dynasties of Egypt that had retreated back into that region. So I got you through to the Judea Second Temple period. This is actually the most confusing part. So if you can follow through this, like we're going to be good for the rest of the chart.
Go for it, bro.
Are you guys still following? Like,
Yeah.
I think I explained that pretty well, but like this whole Hyksos, like the whole like Egyptian Israeli Hyksos thing is really confusing, and it took me a really long time to understand it. And that's, I mean, the thing is, it's like there's no written record, like there's no history. So I mean, it's probably list the sources on like one hand of like what we even know this history from. It's from, you know, like hieroglyphs on certain temples, and then like obviously you take the Bible as like a possibility, but you sort of have to reconcile that with what has been discovered archaeologically.
Yeah, bro, you really killing it. Dropping knowledge on a lot of stuff that is hard to research, and doing pretty well at it. Like summing up a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I almost killed myself researching this, and I was lucky. I had a couple people really help me. Like, I had one woman who is a classics major from Australia. I don't know if it's obvious, but classics is like the study of like this ancient history. And then another guy from California, Mickey Magistus, who I'm not even sure why he researched this stuff so much. He's like writing a fiction novel, but he knew a lot about this and really like, you know, guided me to get to like the important bullet points. Like he like really like pushed me to put like research like the Hyksos. And it is true because like, you know, later in my research, I discovered like whole books about like the Hyksos, and so yeah, I was guided by certain people to like go down these directions, but then like confirmed it later, like through like whole books and other articles. So I think I've gotten us down to Judea Second Temple period on the right, but kind of need to explain a little bit more like what happened with the pharaohs on the left here and some of the most important points around there. So the pharaohs, I'm going to jump a little bit, but the most important point about the pharaohs is that during the 18th dynasty, which is actually considered the New Kingdom, it's like kind of what we think about like Egypt in its prime. And now I differ with mainstream archaeologists here because, you know, they might say Egypt in its prime is when they built the Great Pyramids, but as I'm sure all of we know in this chat, and anyone who's watched Ancient Aliens knows, that the pyramids were most likely built long before the documented Egyptian dynasties that we consider mainstream Egyptian history. So this would be, I guess you could call it the golden age of the Egyptians within the last like 5,000 years, because the pyramids were probably built a long time before that, and the Sphinx as well, even older. So the 18th dynasty is really when we get like the hieroglyphs that we all recognize, and definitely the Temple of Karnak, which is like one of the largest temples in Egypt, was built during that period. It was continuously built, and every pharaoh just expanded on this one temple more and more and more. That's why this temple is like multiple football fields huge. This is near the city of Luxor, which is much further south than Cairo and the Great Pyramids. But so we're into the 18th dynasty. There's the 18th dynasty is actually who drove out the Hyksos. So the 18th dynasty, their first pharaoh kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt. So that's when the Hyksos left, and that would be when theoretically, possibly, we could consider that to be like Exodus of the Hebrews, is the expulsion of the Hyksos. So the 18th dynasty gets going, and the important pharaoh to recognize here is actually the pharaoh who was sort of a, how shall I say, he was sort of like the black sheep of the 18th dynasty. This dude, Akhenaten, he basically tossed the old religion out and started this new religion called Atenism, which was the first religion, I think, in the world. I'm not sure what's going on in the Far East because I don't really research the Far East quite as much. But I think this is the first religion in the world, Atenism, which was monotheism. And the Aten is the sun disk. And so their symbol of the sun disk was like a disk with little hands emanating out every direction. And this was what you could consider, so if you see Akhenaten Atenism in the center there, near, like to the left of Pharaoh's is his bullet points on the side margin. You could consider this totalitarian monotheism because the old polytheistic religion was outlawed. And I think he even started trying to destroy like the hieroglyphics and like the record of the old religion, but didn't get very far. But this religion was like you had to practice Atenism. And he moved like the capital of Egypt again to a different city. And this was like the city that was the capital of his religion. And basically he pissed off all the priests of the old religion because I'm not sure if you would consider them like unemployed, but they were just like up shit's creek basically because, you know, they knew this old religion and he's trying to completely change everything. Like you can imagine their dissatisfaction. But
he's ending like an entire religion. He's shifting an entire culture in a whole different direction. That's like, oh, that's completely devastating to a culture, you know?
Exactly.
I can imagine the people weren't too happy with it either.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think anyone was very happy with it. But so a few things to note about this Akhenaten, the bullet points under him, it says hermaphroditic. So when you look at sculptures of him, he's like, he basically has women's hips and like, I think he has like breasts too. Like he's kind of like a little hermaphrodite. And so that's kind of unusual. And, you know, some people might say he's kind of like an alien, but like people actually think he had this certain like genetic disorder that makes you have like some feminine traits, even though you're a man. And I only mention that because it sort of ties into the whole Baphomet worship, which comes out later, which is this like hermaphroditic, like goat human. So some of that Baphomet worship might actually be inspired by this pharaoh Akhenaten, who sort of started this monotheism, and he had some of those same features. So, but anyways, he didn't last long. He was, you know, it's not, I haven't really found a clear story of what happened at the end of his reign, but he either died or was overthrown. I don't think he lasted very long. And then the priests basically went right back to the old religion. I think, I'm not sure who actually like the very next ruler was, but in one way or another, like, I don't think it was like his son or it wasn't like his direct bloodline. I think actually his wife ruled afterwards, and the priests sort of like took control and reverted Egypt back to the old religion, and then actually almost erased every trace of Akhenaten and Atenism. Like they completely destroyed the city he built, and he was really almost completely erased from the Egyptian record. And the existence of Akhenaten was only discovered and like revealed to modern, the modern world and modern historians. Like, well, I want to say either in like the late 1800s or early 20th century.
So what would you say? What would you say, real quick? Some people believe and say that Akhenaten was Moses. I mean, you know, it kind of does make sense. What would you say to that?
I would say that's a possibility for sure. Like, you know, I don't think there's, there might not be like a direct, there's not like an obvious direct tie to Moses. Like I've definitely seen other suggestions, like not Akhenaten. Like I actually have right here, I'll drop a meme in. Now, I'm not following this meme like directly.
I think it's important to point out like the correlation of, in the pattern cultures.
Yeah, definitely. So like this meme is putting Moses as Tutmos III, who came before Akhenaten, but he was part of that same 18th dynasty. So, I would definitely say that Moses, in terms of timeline and action and historical achievements, does probably tie to one of these pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. This one saying Tutmos III. There's also I felt like there was some sign or some indication that Moses connects back to actually Tutmos IV, which I'm not sure if that's Tutmos III's father, if there's someone in between. But you look at the name Tutmos. There's different spellings of it. For one thing, the way I've spelled it on the Cult of Baal map, it's spelled basically Tutmosis. And so you see right there the similarity phonemically between Moses and Tutmosis. And I'm not just making that spelling up. Like that, there's different ways to spell it.
No, you're exactly right, and it's a good point, because if it was an Egyptian pharaoh that was Moses there, that transformed into what we know now as Moses, it would make sense that he would get like pretty much a kingdom, so to speak, a smaller kingdom to follow him out into the desert to become his servants, his slaves, if you will, and his followers.
Yeah, for sure. It was, it's the priesthood of this 18th dynasty that I'm saying could have, or that did go and form that 21st dynasty, which I say could possibly be the Israel United Monarchy. So yeah, I think, there's evidence that the story of Moses could have possibly been inspired partially by Akhenaten, definitely in the sense that Akhenaten, formed the first monotheistic religion, for sure. And we have these two little images in the middle, the Sphinx stele and the tablets of the law. And the Sphinx stele, so this blew my mind. So in between the two paws of the Sphinx is what's called a stele, which is basically, you can think of it like a giant gravestone. It's like a big stone slab that Egyptians carve a message onto, that's either like a historical record of something that happened or, like whatever they want. And so this Sphinx stele has, it's sort of a vague message, but there's different interpretations. But I read a whole article about this, and I think at the deepest level of interpretation of what's written on this Sphinx stele is that Tutmosis kind of had a vision of monotheism, because I think he had a vision where like multiple gods were combined. And so Tutmosis IV was Akhenaten's something like great grandfather. And so I think possibly what happened was that, this dude Tutmosis had a vision of all these religions combined, basically the vision of monotheism, put this stele right in between the Sphinx's feet that like outlines this, the origin of this, like the conception of this idea. And then I think that this religion was practiced within like the elite of this ruling pharaonic family. They were practicing Atenism for the next few generations, and that Akhenaten was just the first one who decided to be like, make it public and enforce it on everyone else. So, I feel like what I just said made a lot of sense. But so yeah, like it could be Moses, but then like Akhenaten was the first one who tried to enforce it. And then since he failed, they sort of had to like back off and like regroup and then like figure out a different way to go about it. So I'm trying to get you guys like up to the Roman Empire here, and it's this is one of the hardest jumps between the pharaohs and the Roman Empire, because there's a lot of stuff that happened in between. The pharaoh kingdoms were constantly shifting. Like at times they were invaded by people from the south. That's why everyone says that, oh, the pharaohs were black, but it's like, well, yeah, there were some dynasties that were black, but not, I don't think every dynasty of pharaohs was black, because there was Nubian pharaohs and that sort of assimilated to their culture. But then, I don't think that's the main line of power that continued through time. And I mean, there's a lot of very clear ties between the Egyptian pharaohs and like the way the Vatican is set up, especially like not even just the Romans, but like when you look at the Vatican, like just a lot of the symbolism and like the religious garb, it's very clearly influenced by Egyptian stuff. And so I was trying to find the connections between these societies, and it's a little bit tough because, in between the pharaohs, you have the Greeks came into power. Let me just look at this world. I have like a world history timeline that's like right next to me because it gets confusing. Definitely like the Phoenicians were in there. The Greeks kind of came a little bit after the Phoenicians. And, obviously like the Greeks are in Greece and the Phoenicians were kind of all over. So it gets confusing geographically too. And like this history timeline has the Egypt ending with the Persian Empire, which is an expansion of Babylon. I mean, the history of Babylon is probably even more, or just as complicated, if not even more complicated than Egypt, because you have all these different periods like Babylon, Neo-Babylon, Assyrian, like Neo-Assyrian, and then it all kind of merges into the Persian Empire. So that's that in a nutshell. But between the pharaohs and the Romans, like I was saying, you had the Phoenicians and then the Greeks. Obviously, like the Romans sort of evolved from the Greeks, or at least like cultural wise, they, were more inspired by the Greeks than the pharaohs. When you look at Greek culture, you see some Egyptian influence, and you also see some Babylonian influence. So I think, the Greeks were a little bit of a merging of the Egyptian and the Babylonian. And then the Romans were sort of a refinement on that. But the one very concrete connection I did find between the pharaohs and the Roman Empire was that Julius Caesar, who we've all heard of. So I went into this, just preface, I went into this thinking Julius Caesar was the first Roman emperor. Like, that's not true. I think he's right before the first Roman emperor. He's the first Roman emperor. Do I have it written on here? I think it was like Augustus. I don't know. Help me with the first Roman emperor, anyone? No. Well, I don't judge if you don't judge. But Julius Caesar was the first one before the first emperor. So in a way, he's kind of like the founder of like the empire, but he wasn't actually an emperor. He was a military dude, like a general, I guess, or I don't know, like commander. So he actually had a marriage with Cleopatra, who was an Egyptian princess. And, we've all heard of Cleopatra, but there's actually several Cleopatras. So Julius Caesar was the one that married Cleopatra 7. So, there's probably more connections that go through the Greek culture, through the pharaohs to Greek and then Greek to Roman. But that was a very strong connection, the strongest one I could find directly between the Roman Empire and the pharaoh elite bloodline. And, all you really need is one marriage to not necessarily like concrete, like an alliance like that, but to just show that these were like allies, that they were working together. That, I mean, it is pretty clear when you understand like the way these societies work, that the bloodline is like paramount to them. Like the bloodline is so important that it continues like their bloodline as the elite, as the rulers through history. So, I'm trying to find a proof, and there is a proof through Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. It just, it might not seem that significant, but it's there, it's there in the historical record that there's a bloodline tie between the pharaohs and the Romans, and that there's probably more than one. That's, there's probably a lot of ties between them. It's just that's the most obvious one that I could locate.
I thought Apache had a question.
Oh, right. So we see like you're talking about Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, and we can kind of correlate that with marrying of the bloodlines, kind of like Solomon and Sheba, and these different ways to unite the different bloodlines and to kind of unify the kingdoms to kind of create other kingdoms to tear down certain power structures and kind of replace as the face or the moving hand of the power structure, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, like Marie Antoinette just came to mind. You know, like when Austria married into France, it's like it kind of consecrates the alliance between the bloodlines. So about the Romans, Jupiter was their main god. Saturn was another very prominent god, and you know he had a festival called Saturnalia, which involved orgies and sacrifices. I probably don't need to explain like the extent of human sacrifice that went on in the Roman Empire. Like they had gladiator battles. Like so much of our culture is actually inspired by and you know a modernized version of Roman culture, and you know definitely like Roman gladiator. Sorry, yeah. Roman gladiator battles are the inspiration for like all of our modern professional sports. One interesting note about Julius Caesar is that if you read his Wikipedia, it says that he claimed he came from Venus's bloodline. So, you know, not only did he marry into Cleopatra, but he's claiming he came from Venus's bloodline, which, as you see on the deity chart, that Venus ties back to Lucifer. So
Saturnalia turned into modern day Christmas.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, definitely not the same not the same like ritual practices, but I think the time of the holiday and certain things about it probably do tie to Christmas. Bibbidi, you know?
Yeah, it was adapted and modified for Christmas after, you know, they basically tried to strip it of the religion it was associated with, and then they tied it to a new.
Yeah, I mean, all those Christian holidays definitely line up date-wise to pagan holidays in the past.
Yep, and a lot of the things like hanging stockings and such that are related to Christmas, even leaving cookies and milk, are tied to pagan rituals and stuff. Really,
and I think the tree ties to some like druid rituals too, right?
Yup, bro. It's all sick. The way that they pervert. You know, this is one thing. It's kind of always piqued my mind when we know that certain things like Israel was created. You know, the Vatican was created. You know, I wonder if even the Bible was tainted with that kind of thing. If it was, you know, we know that it's been considered control of the masses, but if it was actually just kind of originated as that, if that was the intent initially, and it was, you know, created by maybe like it was a more original and successful watchtower, right, where it was created by a bloodline, and it is basically brainwashed people that are all kept in line.
I think to an extent it is, but like the thing to understand is that, one second, I gotta let go of my button because I'm like typing on my thing. 1 second. Yeah, like the thing to understand is that they mix like the truthful good sections of these scriptures with sections that aren't so good that like they add in. So you know there's stuff that appeals to people that's definitely like true and like you know good to believe in, but then there's also these control mechanisms thrown in, like especially you know like submissiveness to like the Pope figure and totalitarianism, and you know what they did with it in like the Inquisition is just like horrifying. But so like they kind of like lure you in with like some good ideas, but then like attach it to these like really negative practices. So yeah, definitely. And I think we are at so we're at this period between like the Roman Empire and Judea when monotheism is created. I mean, it's already it's created when they established Judea, if not before that. When they returned the Torah to Judea at start the Second Temple period, and at the same time you have the Romans who are polytheistic. You know, they have Jupiter, Saturn, and all their gods, trying to find a monotheistic religion because monotheism works really well for absolute monarchies. And so once they become an empire, they you know they're trying to keep their empire together, and they see that monotheism is a good way to keep all the people happy, to have it like not be different cults fighting with each other. So something that I learned doing this that I never really knew was that Rome actually tried 3 different attempts to do monotheistic religion before the Christianity stuck. And one of the ones just prior to Christianity was Sol Invictus, which was another form of sun worship that was almost I don't want to say identical to Atenism because I haven't really studied either of them well enough to know, but Atenism was the worship of the sun disk, and then Sol Invictus was the worship of like Sol, which is the sun, and kind of personifying the sun. Another thing to note that is not as prominent of a point on the Cult of Baal map as it is on the Sephiroth map, or the original Sephiroth map. This religion called Mithraism is an important religion in Rome to understand because, let me say it again, Mithraism. Well, first of all, you see just in the word, it's the myth of Ra, so that's tying it back to Egyptian religions. But Mithraism was actually a Persian origin religion, and a lot of the practice of it involved bull slaughter. So when you see, like if you look up Mithraism on Wikipedia, the picture you'll see is of a statue of a human slaughtering a bull, like slitting a bull's throat. And this was a religion that was popular among the Roman army, which obviously is a very important part of the Roman Empire. There you go, you got the bull. So it's just showing you again, like, I don't even know if I've mentioned necessarily that the Baal is like the bull head with like a human body that takes like blood sacrifice. But, this is showing that like the Roman soldiers were into this religion that is clearly a modified version of Baalism because, they're spilling like bull blood as like the main ritual of the religion. There you go. There's Baal. I mean, the Baal worship, which was like really historians have really placed the Baal worship that's associated with child sacrifice with the Phoenicians. So they were saying that like Carthage, which was the Phoenician capital established around 800 BC, was kind of the center of this Baal religion that practiced human sacrifice openly, that practiced child sacrifice openly. It was like an open part of their culture that, if they were having a drought or if they were about to be invaded, like they could sacrifice their children to Baal and hopefully change their fortune. But so like the thesis of this is that the Baal worship kind of was similar to the Set worship of the Hyksos, and then it's similar to the Mithraism of the Romans and the cult of Saturn of the Romans. And then, that same philosophy is part of the Vatican at its core. Now, something to note here is that the Romans were at war with that Judea Second Temple period. Let me just say, I think I said this before we started, but Judea refers to, I think at times it was a kingdom in that region, the Israel region, I'm saying. Now we call it Israel, so it's so easy. We think Israel, we know exactly what it is. So it's tempting to just say Israel, but, this is like a shifting kingdom. And I think after Cyrus freed them, they were sort of like a feudal to the Babylonians, but then the Romans came and conquered throughout the Babylonians, and then they were sort of in charge of Judea, but they gave Judea some autonomy as well. This king, Herod the Great, Roman appointed king of the Judea, was at 40 BC. This is on the Cult of Baal map. So it's like they had their own king, but they were sort of like feudal to the Romans. And then, it was constant like rebellion going on. And that's what you call the Judean Wars, which there's a big, long Roman book about the Judean Wars written by Josephus Flavius. And, I don't want to sound too smart like I read it or anything, but in that book is where it actually puts out the theory or the thesis that the Hebrews were the Egyptian Hyksos. So, I mean, aside from these modern books that have been written about trying to figure out who the Hebrews really were, you have Josephus Flavius of the Romans writing the book Judean Wars and writing that the Hebrews were actually these Hyksos dynasty pharaohs. So the Romans, like I'm saying, like the Romans and the Judea are constantly or not constantly, but there's like revolts going on, there's wars going on. And eventually the Roman Emperor Titus invades Judea and destroys the Second Temple. And at that point you have like from what I read about, it's like the near total genocide within that region or within like the core of Judea. Like he really like exterminates. That is 70 AD, or That was tiny text. Where's the second temple? Emperor Titus, second temple. Oh God, it's so small on my paper. It's like practically invisible. Yeah, I was right. 70 AD. See, I have this stuff memorized because I've written all of it. It's 70 AD. Is Emperor Titus destroyed. There you go. I was just gonna say, pull up that image. So yeah, on the Arch of Titus in Rome, you have this relief engraving of the Roman soldiers bringing home the loot from Jerusalem. And it's just, when I saw this, I was kind of shocked because, we think of Rome in such a positive light, I feel like, and nowadays we're like, always comparing ourselves to Rome and, all roads lead to Rome. But you have, this kind of like, it's not erased history, but it's definitely not taught that the Romans completely like obliterated the Jewish culture like 70 years after Christ supposedly lived. So it's just interesting that, those are the same people who then decided, I guess it would be about 200 years later or so, maybe 300 years, to adopt this religion. So it's just really a complete reversal of going from like exterminating these people to adopting, the Old Testament to be the first book of the Bible. And so it's kind of like a mind fuck. Like, how did this culture go from trying to exterminate them to taking their religion as like the state religion? And it's more of a complicated proof than I can explain right now. But it's I think like the key to it is that they're satanic. No, I don't know. Let me just go back to the left side and maybe we'll get there. How are we on time? I feel like I've been talking for like hours.
You're doing great, bro.
I think we can accelerate a little bit. Like, we really have gotten through like the complicated part. I think, and a lot of people like kind of know this history going forward, like the early part was a really confusing part. And then going forward, I feel like people know like a little bit more and the connections might be easier to explain. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And then we'll still get a little bit of time for the question.
For sure. So Rome establishes the Vatican. Constantine was the emperor at the time of like that Council of Nicaea, which I think was the first council that decided that Christianity would be the state religion. And also that council decided which books were in the Bible, which books were out of the Bible. So like the book of Enoch was out of the Bible, and then like the Torah was in the Bible is what was decided then. And they also were the ones who decided that Jesus was the Son of God, like during that council. Jesus had followers before, which were the Gnostics, which I think he had multiple like sects of followers, but like the Gnostics were one of the main ones. And they believed that the world was ruled by archons and that you would find redemption through gnosis, which is gaining wisdom. They had a whole different set of gods that are really crazy looking if you want to look them up. A few of them are listed here: Abraxas and Yaldabaoth. Now, I think Yaldabaoth was kind of analogous to Satan. They considered Yaldabaoth to be like Lord Archon. And it was basically like a negative entity who was ruling over Earth. And I think they felt that Jesus had come and like helped them, helped guide them with like his teachings. But they definitely didn't believe that the Hebrew God was, the good guy in the situation. Like, they thought that the world was ruled by evil entities, and that they followed Jesus to try to find knowledge and conquer these evil entities. Oh, nice archon you posted there. So yeah, the Gnostics considered who we think of as God, or who his original name in the Hebrew was Yahweh. They considered him to be Lord Archon and like the evil one. And they didn't believe there was a good one that like opposed him. Like, they thought, the only way to find redemption was to learn things for yourself through gnosis. So yeah, a lot of people have a hard time like wrapping their mind around, like, we're so built into like the God and Satan construct that people really, they don't want to accept that there might not be a good one, that there might just be, like on this chart, like Lucifer and Satan. But then there's different ways to understand like what a good God is, because like if the good God is say like within, or maybe like a universal consciousness, or like what a lot of like New Age, or what people like 5D would call like source. That's we consider to be another name for God, like the way that most Christians think of God. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Shout out to 5D, map maker, made one Grand Solar Flash. Boom.
Yeah. He's definitely into this whole like source concept as God. And so am I, actually. I think a lot of people are starting to see God as more of like a universal collective consciousness source, as opposed to like a personification necessarily, or like a, but then, I mean, there's also like these New Agers believe in like archangels and like communication with like specific like energies, like Christ consciousness. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but yeah, like, so like the Gnostics looked at it as like the Hebrew God was kind of the bad one. But then the Vatican came along and said that Hebrew God was the good one, or that was the Jesus's father. And so that's how it was from then on. And most people don't know at all that there was even any other ideas about Jesus or any other religions based on Jesus other than what's taught in basic Christianity, which is all derived from the Vatican version. I think I said early on that the Protestants basically just threw out the Pope and like modified Catholicism a little bit, whereas the original Christians had a bunch of like very different ideas about Jesus and about, well, it wouldn't even be Christianity back then, but followers of Jesus had different ideas other than what became the codified Bible version of Christianity. So from here, I think we can jump like kind of fast like through these things. I think even I'm getting a little bit tired. I mean, has it been almost 2 hours?
Like an hour and a half.
All right. Well, it gets pretty simple. Okay. So the Rome eventually loses Judea to the Persian Empire. Okay. Or at that point, they become Muslim by then. So Islam's created 632 AD. There's theories that the Vatican actually created Islam, like for a reason of maybe controlling this region, like maybe kind of doing like a controlled burn of some of these other religions, because so they created like the most extreme form of intolerant religion that they could to get rid of the people that oppose them. So that's one theory. Like there's a whistleblower named Alberto Riviera, who claims that he's like a defected Jesuit that has insider knowledge that the Vatican did create Islam as a weapon of ethnic cleansing. But either way, like it kind of got out of control. Either it got out of control, or this was the intent to have like perpetual war in the region, which is still going on today. But so Islam takes over Israel. The Vatican then eventually does the Crusades to take back the Israel region, the Holy Land. So that's why the Knights Templar are created as the soldiers to retake the Holy Land for the Vatican. I don't know if I guess I'll try to really briefly mention every point on this main chart because they are kind of interesting and important. But the Praetorian Guard, which connects the Roman Empire to the Templars, what that is signifying is the Praetorian Guard was an elite force within the army that was specifically to protect the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor. And what eventually happened with the Praetorian Guard was that they took on too much power, and sort of like exactly like what happened with JFK, the Praetorian Guard started becoming responsible for assassinating the emperors, and it declined from like an empire into like a military dictatorship, with the Praetorian Guard actually choosing the next emperors. I guess that kind of like would interfere with the idea of like a bloodline being continuous, but somehow maybe like at the height of the bloodline, that's what they want, is a military dictatorship. So that's what happened with the Praetorian Guard. It's just like the elite force that takes over and starts dictating like the policy, becoming a military dictatorship. And so the Templars never did the same thing to the Vatican, but you'll see later on the Jesuits kind of become a similar force to the Praetorian Guard, and then the CIA sort of becomes a similar force to the Jesuits later on. So it's sort of this pattern that's repeating throughout history. That's why that's an important point to understand. Okay, so we're down to the Knights Templar. We got to get to the Khazars on the right. Okay, so the Khazars were a kingdom that was between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in like southwestern Asia. And through that region was a lot of Jewish refugees fleeing like the persecution of the Romans. And they had established Jewish trade routes all over the entire world, these were Jewish people called the Radhanites. So you can look up like Radhanite trade routes. And actually, I can drop it in here. But the Radhanites had trade routes that spanned all over like the entire like ancient world. And so they were, that region of Khazaria was very important to the Silk Road because it was central between Europe and Asia. And so they were sort of like the arbiters of this like global trade. And the Radhanites had already established their routes all over. And so they had a very strong influence in Khazaria. And so the original kingdom of Khazaria was the basically kind of descendants of like Attila the Hun. Like they had been sort of like organized by Attila the Hun originally, but then they sort of broke off into their own little kingdom. So those peoples originally practiced, basically it was called Tengrism, which is a sky religion of a sky god. And there's obvious parallels between that and Baal worship, because Baal was like the storm god, the sky god. I mean, basically between the two main archetypes, like the Satan archetype and the Lucifer archetype, Satan is always more like representing the sky god, the storm god, the sky god, whereas Venus, Lucifer, Isis is usually more like representing the earth god, also like moon. So their god, the god of the Khazars, was Tengrism, shamanic sky god. So they were in a way practicing like a form of Baalism, and they were known as being like very like brutal. I mean, this is like the Hun, like they call them like the Horde. I mean, they refined into a more of like a developed culture, but they would definitely have been considered like pagans, and maybe even like kind of like extreme pagans. So especially like their neighbors, like everything that had been written about them was just talking about like how savage they were, and like how like no one could pass through Khazaria because like they would like immediately be like robbed and have their identity stolen. So there's a few like very negative adjectives about the Khazars below that title, but a lot of this is how they were known like before they even converted to Judaism. But it's just important to understand that they were kind of these like somewhat civilized but somewhat barbaric culture in that region that derived from Asians, but was also heavily infiltrated and controlled by these Jewish Radhanite merchants. So eventually, due to pressures from their neighboring regions, I think they had the Muslims to the south and like the Christians also to the south, but also to the west. They were influenced to convert to one of these Abrahamic religions, and they decided, the kings Bulan and Obadiah, I think. Bulan and Obadiah, they decided to convert the kingdom to Judaism to sort of be like an in-between between like the Christians and the Muslims. It's actually a decision that is pretty hard to understand in a historical context, because the Jewish people were kind of universally persecuted. So it's like, why would this independent kingdom want to, convert to Judaism? But nonetheless, they did. I think there was strong influence of these Radhanites, like were really controlling the region. And so they converted to Judaism. That's how the Radhanites connect to them. I think that they influenced that conversion. Eventually, that kingdom just fell apart. I think they were invaded by people from the north and from the south, and they were driven out. And so this is where it gets into a point where there's a little bit of contention between what, say, like conspiracy theory researchers and mainstream historians say what happened. So I think mainstream historians pretty much say that the Khazars just dissolved and kind of like went nowhere. Just the whole culture sort of like disappeared. But then this dude, Arthur Russell, who wrote the book The 13th Tribe, which is kind of the most, I think, well-known book that's about the Khazars and their history, and like from like a truthful, not anti-Semitic standpoint, but from like a truthful, like really trying to figure out history standpoint, and not just like, paint the Jewish people as like in a good light, which is not really painting them in a bad light. But his theory is that a lot of these Khazars then migrated to Europe and formed the basis for the Jewish communities in Germany and Spain. Which is, I think it's probably a little bit of combination of both. I think some Khazars definitely probably immigrated to Europe and joined Jewish communities there. And then also, obviously, like Jewish people that came out of Judea, while the Romans were like persecuting, like created refugees, and they went to other regions as well. So, I think that the Jewish population in Europe is probably a mix of these Khazars and the original people from Judea. And I mean, it's not like one of them was the synagogue of Satan, one of them wasn't, but because I think the synagogue of Satan, which is the caption on the Judea thing, that term comes from the Bible, and the Bible says that there's this section of the Jews that's the synagogue of Satan. It's not clear if the Bible is saying all the Jews or some of them, or it's the ones that wouldn't accept Jesus. So it's I think that synagogue of Satan is primarily associated with this group. It's like a sect of the Jews, which was called the Pharisees, which was kind of like the elite sect. So again, it's like, it's not saying all of them, but it's like the elites of them, which is concentrated in this sect called the Pharisees. And it's also interesting to note that phonemically, Pharisees and pharaohs, that's just something I noticed, that the two names, like, why is the name of this Jewish sect like so, it sounds so similar phonemically to the pharaohs, the Pharisees? It's like, why would you want to be named after your slave owner? So let's see, I sort of went back there a little bit because I forgot to describe that caption before. So let's just jump back to the right. So I have Baphomet on the Templars. The Templars, let's see, Friday the 13th, 1307. So Friday the 13th, 1307 is when the French king decided, or I'm not sure if, I think that's when the French king issued a decree to basically arrest all the Templars, and they were accused of worshiping Baphomet and homosexuality, which was like a really big problem in that day, or a really big sin, I guess. And he started like burning all of them on stakes, and basically Templars were outlawed at that point. So, Templars had their day between like 1119 and 1307, and then they pretty much get wiped off the face of the earth, like publicly wiped off the face of the earth. So there's a lot of theories about like what actually happened to the Templars. Like you guys might have heard. So I think some of them did. They escaped Europe from this persecution by the French king, and then the Vatican jumped on board at that point too. They kind of went underground. Some of them became pirates. Some of them got burned on the stake. Some of them might have gone to the New World even, who knows. But before that happened, the Templars established a country. Like when their last fortress in the Holy Land fell, which was Acre, that's what you see to the left of Switzerland. You have a little illustration that says Holy Land, fall of Acre. That's when the Templars left the Holy Land for the last time. And it was only actually 2 months later that Switzerland had its original charter signed. And so that's the thesis that comes from that Chatzephrats, the Pharaoh show video, is that the Templars were the original ones who established Switzerland. So there's evidence of that, and that they had established the banking system near the Templars, medieval banking, yeah. The connection between the Templars and Switzerland says Pontifical Guard, which I'm not sure if you guys have heard or have seen the images of, if you could pull up an image of Pontifical Guard, that'd be great. But basically, Swiss soldiers guard the Vatican. And so there's clearly this connection between the Vatican and Switzerland. Like, why do Swiss soldiers guard the Vatican, like, still in 2018? Well, it's because Switzerland was founded by the Templars. And so the Swiss were kind of like the original, like, OG, like the home base of the Templars. And so, like, while the Knights Templar may have been persecuted by the French king and then subsequently the Vatican, like, jumped on board, they still have their home base in Switzerland, and you still have, like, the Swiss guards defending the Vatican. So it's clearly this, like, really strong alliance between the Vatican and Switzerland that has existed ever since the founding of Switzerland. And you see, especially, like, I think in World War II, like, the alliance between the Vatican and Switzerland, how they're both sort of, like, exempt from the war, and they're both kind of, like, helping each other out in different ways. Okay. So let's see, where are we? Let's get this is kind of like what happened to the Khazars. So I've kind of explained how the Khazars, their country fell, and they most likely immigrated to Europe. So they would be immigrating to Europe as Jews. And in the Middle Ages in Europe, so we have court Jews connecting the Khazars to Switzerland. Now, this isn't like a direct connection between the Khazars and Switzerland, but if these are some, like, rich Jews coming to Europe, what happened to the rich Jews in Europe is that they were made into court Jews, or another word for that is a court factor. And that is a member of, like, a royal court who would handle the money of the king or of the royal family. And this was done as a liability to the royal family, that, if something went wrong, sometimes that court factor would be responsible instead of the royal. And I think there was even some court factors who may have even been executed as a result of the royal dying, who owed money to people, and then the court factor would be held responsible. So this wasn't, like, a very desirous position. It was a position as a tool of the royal family. It's just crazy to me that, I mean, that was history I had never knew, that there was something even called a court Jew or a court factor. And part of the reason they used Jews in that role was because Jews were exempt from usury. Like, I think Christians were not allowed to maybe charge interest, and then the Jews were, according to their religion. So that's why they would use them in this position. So they'd be committing usury, but, like, through an agent, basically. And then the other thing coming out of Khazars is conversos. And conversos is Jews in the Middle Ages who were forced to convert to Christianity. Some of them through the Inquisition, like, that was a big part of the Inquisition, especially in Spain, was forcing the Jews to convert to Christianity. Like, there was a lot of hostility toward Jews in Europe during this whole period. In Europe, there was a lot of hostility toward Jews during that period. So yeah, the Inquisition involved forcing a lot of Jews to convert to Christianity, and a lot of them, once they converted, still practiced Judaism secretly, which were called crypto Jews, was Jews that were forced to convert to Catholicism that still secretly practiced Judaism, like, in their home, but then in the public life they would present themselves as Christians. So that takes us down to the Jesuits bubble. Let me make sure that we've covered enough in the other areas. So in the middle of that little triangle, you see the fall of Atil. Now that's just the capital of Khazaria. So that would be the Khazar Exodus, we call it. The Khazars, the country dissolving, and the people of that country either migrating to Europe, or who knows where they went. Like, the theory from the person who wrote the 13th Tribe book is that most of them migrated to Europe, and became the elites became these court Jews and conversos in high positions of power. And so we're at the Inquisition, and the thing to understand about the Inquisition is that it started in Switzerland. The first part of the Inquisition, or the Inquisition, started with this thing called the Valais witch trial. And so Valais is a city in Switzerland, and they had the first like witch trial that was sort of the archetype for, I guess, the rest of the Inquisition. And it was around that time that this book, The Hammer of the Witches, which has another name, I think it's like Malefactus Malefictorum or something in a different language, but that's 1487. So this was a book written in, actually, when I just researched it before we started this, it's actually written in Germany. But, you know, at this point, the elites across Europe are all interconnected. And this book basically spelled out the legal procedure for identifying and burning people who were accused of being witches. And so it's just, you know, it's a really sick document, and it's really sick that this document became like the justification for like witch burnings across all of Europe for how long did the Inquisition go on for? Well, it started with that Valais witch trial, 1487, and definitely went through like the Protestant Reformation, probably the creation of the Jesuits. So, you know, you had almost 100 years of like burning witches, most likely. Some sick times. So now at the same time, you have the power structure starts expanding and becoming, you know, more decentralized rapidly in this period of like the Middle Ages. And these points jump around a lot. They don't exactly connect like directly, but so there's a lot of points jumping in between. We have Venetians coming out of Switzerland, and we have Black nobility at the top of the Switzerland node. And I think most of you guys probably know what Black nobility is, but that's just the nobility of Europe, you know, the people ruling Europe. Black nobility, the name not Black nobility came originally from Venetians because the nobility in Venice would wear all black. And so they became known as Black nobility. And then Venice was just an important city for a number of reasons. In that city was developed like a lot of these sort of Masonic traditions that carried through all the way to the Freemasons and to the occultists today. The Venice was a trade and luxury capital. So in a way that the elites sort of got their grasp on the economy through Venice, because it became like the center for trade and luxury goods. And while at the same time, they were taking their grasp on the financial world, like originally from the Templars. And then I think in the very beginning of this, we went through the moving of the banking capital, which went from Florence, Italy, to Hamburg, Germany, to Amsterdam, and then finally to London. So a really important point, or like four important points that really lead to the development of like the modern world are here in this little quadrants, like right below Switzerland. So you have, it's a little bit tough to follow the chronology of these because they're sort of all like thrown in there. But you have the Dutch East India Company, the Bank of England, United Kingdom, and then Freemasonry. And it's in that order. And then actually the Rothschilds come after Freemasonry. But so that's the chronology, is like Dutch East India, 1602. So just to explain that a little bit, the Jesuits were formed as a response to the Protestant Reformation, which was a response to the Inquisition. So, you know, you have the Catholic Church burning everyone across Europe. And like, you know, the regular everyday people are getting a little bit sick of this, and, you know, they want to leave the Catholic Church, but they don't want to leave their religion. So that's why Protestantism is formed, and it's called the Protestant Reformation. And then the Jesuits are formed by the Vatican Church as a response to the Protestant Reformation. And so when most people think of Jesuits, they think of the Jesuits as educators. And, you know, we think there's Jesuit schools, there's Jesuits colleges. They think of Jesuits as the main like missionaries of the Vatican. And that's definitely all true. But then what they don't know is that the Jesuits also have a very powerful role in controlling trade and in controlling the economy, and also as sort of like a secret service, like a CIA type organization. Like they're responsible for assassinations the Vatican wants to carry out, at least back in those days. And I'm sure today. So.
Aren't they also the Black Pope and the Pope that's truly empowered, that is basically commanding over the White Pope, which we more commonly know as the White Pope.
Exactly. Now, since their origin, I wouldn't say that they're in charge of they're over the Vatican at that point. The point when they become over the Vatican is further down on this chart, which is, I guess, well, it'd be the end of the Napoleonic Wars was when they used Napoleon to take over the Vatican and forcibly put themselves above the White Pope. So I think at that point is when they would have gone above the White Pope. But, they've always had a Jesuit superior general, and it's been an intense relationship between the Jesuits and the Vatican, especially in this early period. Like, I think nowadays, like I said, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Jesuits rule. Thank you for the meme. But before that, the Jesuits were struggling to take over the Vatican. This brings me back to a line in the original essay about the Sephiroth map, which says, all these elite secret societies are interlinked as shown on this map, even though they may at times throughout history have been at odds and even at war with one another. It's been a cutthroat power struggle fought tooth and nail between these groups. Cannibals seem to have a propensity for cannibalizing each other along with their innocent victims. Yet somehow, despite their malicious infighting, they manage to be significantly more organized and far more deadly than the general peace-loving population. So you see that really strongly with the relationship between the Jesuits and the Vatican. They're created as, a division to help the Vatican, but then they eventually gain too much power. And so there's several books about the Jesuits that explain that the Jesuits were responsible for assassinating not just one pope or two, but like several popes. Like, you can count them on like two hands the number of popes that the Jesuits have actually assassinated throughout history.
Yep. And something I think everybody should,
go ahead.
If anybody wants to know a little bit more about Jesuits, I think the first thing you should look up is their oath that they take, and it is a really disgusting oath.
Yes, for sure. And there are several books about them. I'm not sure exactly what to tell you to search for, because you'll probably find some nice books about them too, but there's several books about them as like a conspiratorial organization. Do I have the Jesuit oath on here? That's important. I might need to add that bullet point, Redank. Boom. Yeah, that's definitely like, read that Jesuit oath. That's actually on the Q web. So if you don't see it on here, that should be on here. But so yeah, eventually, so to go through this next section, we definitely need to talk about the Jesuits first, because eventually, so I don't want to get ahead. I'm getting a little bit ahead. Let me just say that, so the Jesuits were responsible as the missionaries for the Vatican. And so they were all over the world as like the missionaries, like spreading the religion to, Japan, to Asia, to, I guess America probably even, America had existed at that point. Not the country America, but, the colonies, and, Mexico, Central America. So Jesuits go all over spreading the Vatican's message. And so consequently, the Jesuits are the ones in the best position to facilitate global trade. And the Dutch East India Company is the first, what you would consider a transnational corporation. And the reason they had so much success with that Dutch East India country is because they were in an alliance with the Jesuits. And now this is a little bit confusing, because the Dutch at that time was a Protestant country. And so it's like, why are the Jesuits making an alliance with the Dutch East India? And I'm not really sure what the answer is to that, other than that these people are just complete hypocrites, and they'll earn a buck like over following true to like any religion any day, because their religion is this Satanism, which is like self-serving, and they really don't give a crap about following any of these rules that they claim to set for themselves. Like, their only rule is to enrich themselves and to gain as much power for themselves as they can. And so I think the Jesuits probably saw like an alliance with the Protestant of the Dutch as a way for them to actually get more power than the Vatican eventually. And eventually they did. But before that happened, let's see. what's the order here? So Jesuits, I'm looking for the Jesuit suppression. That's 1769. Okay, so then, okay, so before all that happened, the Dutch East India Company becomes like the biggest, most powerful company in the world. We go into this period called the Dutch Golden Age, which is when the Netherlands, which is the Dutch people, was basically world supremacy in trade, science, military, and art. So through the Jesuits, the Dutch are becoming enriched. Oh, there's a nice book about the Jesuits. And the Dutch, becomes the most powerful country in the world. And in 1688, Prince William III, who's a Dutch prince, invades England and successfully conquers England. So in 1688, this is called the Glorious Revolution, England is taken over by the Netherlands. And so this is a part of history that is completely official history, but nobody like acknowledges it or really like talks about it, especially not English people. It's like, the monarchy of England was completely taken over. It was a bloodless revolution. Nobody died. He just showed up with like the best fleet of ships in the world and a really powerful army. And England was in a weakened state, and they just had no means to even defend themselves. So the Dutch took over England in 1688, and it's part of history that nobody really knows. And that's one of the things that I discovered in making this, that I was like, what? Like, and it's funny, like you can read articles about this in like mainstream sources, but they'll say, they'll just be like, yeah, like not many people acknowledge this, but it happened. And so then what you see after that is like England like falling into this power structure that had been developing, and they had been moving their banking capital around. This is where you see the banking capital move from Amsterdam to London, is after this invasion, and the reason why is because they took over. So shortly after this invasion, from 1688 to 1694 is when they established the Bank of England. So it's very clearly like this Dutch force invaded, and then they established their banking system in England, which is now like one of the the most important global banks in the world today. And not only they established the bank, but then in 1707 they established the actual country, United Kingdom. So there's a little bit of a delay in between that invasion and establishing the new name for the country, but the United Kingdom is clearly a result of the Dutch invasion, which was the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And then just 10 years after that, you have the foundation of the first United Grand Masonic Lodge, which is the United Grand Lodge of England in London. And so this is when Masons really become how we think of them today. Freemasonry becomes what we think of it today. Before that, Freemasons were responsible for building cathedrals. It was like a guild of craftsmen, basically. And once they established that Grand Lodge in England, it goes from like craftsmen to like creepy elites, like doing rituals in private. I mean, I think it was a more gradual transition than that, but that's really the point when it becomes, identifiably what it is today. And within Freemasonry, they claim to be the descendants of the Templars. So theoretically, some of these Templars who didn't get burned on the stakes went underground into hiding and then came back as the Masons when the Freemasons became a thing after 1717, or maybe even before that. They were part of the lodges. But like within Freemasonry, there are how would you say, there are divisions, or there are sects of Freemasonry which call themselves the Templar. And within the Freemasonry like thought, they consider themselves to be the heirs of the Templar. Like they're considered to be like, like their great grandfather was a Templar or whatever. So that's the connection between those two. That's a very direct connection between Knights Templar and Masons, because if you go into lodges, I mean, I went into the Washington's Masonic Memorial outside of Washington, D.C., and on the top floor is what they call the Templar Chapel. And so, I mean, any confusion in my mind at that point about if there's a connection between the Templars and the Masons was pretty much like confirmed, because, you know, within Washington's memorial, there's an actual Templar chapel, which has a standing mannequin of like a Templar in full armor. So, you know, it could have been more obvious. And, you know, they kind of brag about it, you know, like that's like their heritage is like being from Templars. So then you have Masonry has been established at that point. Scottish Rite is basically the branch of Masonry that was, I think, infiltrated by the Jesuits most directly. It's like the most directly controlled like Jesuit branch of Freemasonry. It's a little bit sketchy there. Well, yeah, that's confirmed. So we have Rothschild dynasty, which is a very important point in terms of what becomes the global banking system, because, you know, we all know, I think, who have been following QAnon, like how much we talk about like the Rothschild banks and that, like, you know, they're like controlling everything. But the important point to note, like for me at least, when I learned about that thing called court factors or court Jews, I was like, well, that's so obviously like exactly what the Rothschild bank is, because, you know, it's like, once again, like using a Jewish family to be sort of like the face of this banking structure, when really it behind the scenes is controlled by either the Vatican or the Jesuits. So that's why I think the Rothschild family was given the power it has. Like, I don't think it was like through their own ingenuity or through their own family connections. I mean, the father of the first Rothschild, who was a banker, like was not like anyone important. I mean, I think he was in the business of trading like gold coins, which was what they did back in those days. But he, you know, he was given access to these royal bank accounts. Like, you know, they granted him like this title as court factor. And that's how the family became so rich and powerful. Like, they completely became powerful as a result of being given permission by the royalty to become rich and powerful. Now it gets a little bit more unclear, like further later on, when, you know, we have the Rothschilds giving the Vatican loans. So, you know, in some ways it would appear that, you know, they're what do you call them, like landlord or whatever. Like, if you give someone a loan, like you have control over them. But I think that even when you see the Rothschilds giving the Vatican loans, it's basically like the Vatican giving itself a loan, you know, because I think since the beginning that the Rothschild dynasty has been controlled by the Jesuits and the Vatican. Go ahead.
Yeah, the first Rothschild was actually born poor in the ghetto and was able to rise to his wealth through his job, his profession as a banker. Yep.
Yep. So during this time, they're like, I guess, you know, we're talking 1700s. It's actually in 1773 that the Jesuit suppression happens, which is the Pope declaring the Jesuits as like illegal outlaws, you know, banishing the Jesuits, just dissociating the Vatican from the Jesuits. And this was kind of an agreement between both the Vatican and the European monarchies, because the Jesuits had been interfering so much in both the monarchies and the Vatican, you know, doing assassinations, like putting who they want in charge. Definitely, like several popes had been assassinated. And actually, the Jesuits had just assassinated one pope. Let's see, Pope Clement the 13th assassinated. They thought they had the next pope like under their finger. They thought the next pope was going to be like, everything's all cool. But the next pope actually like turned on them and like got in alliance with like the monarchies and suppressed the Jesuits. So then we see this huge internal power structure going on throughout Europe, of the Jesuits basically trying to regain their control that they had. And the first thing they do after suppression in 1773 is form the Illuminati in 1776. And so, you know, you can definitely read about the Illuminati on Wikipedia, that this Jesuit professor of canon law, former Jesuit professor of canon law, Adam Weishaupt, is the one who founded the Illuminati. And then immediately the Illuminati go about setting forth to infiltrate the Freemasons in both America and in Europe. And the Jesuits go about fomenting what becomes the Napoleonic Wars. So actually, first it's suggested in these books that research the Jesuits that the Jesuits sort of fomented the French Revolution. Like I've heard, you guys have maybe heard these stories about the propaganda flyers about Marie Antoinette that said like "Let them eat cake." Have you heard about those? I'll take that as a yes. Are we recording?
Yes, I've heard of them.
Sorry, I haven't.
Well, if you've seen the movie Marie Antoinette, there's they show that there's like part of the reason that the people turned against the French monarchy was because there was these like propaganda flyers saying that like Marie Antoinette was just like eating cake while everyone in the country was starving. And so it's suggested in these books about the Jesuits that the Jesuits were actually putting out this propaganda and like fermenting this French Revolution. So the French Revolution happened, and then shortly thereafterwards, the Napoleonic Wars happened, where like this French king, or I guess you call him a king, took over basically all of Europe. And what I learned doing this map is that Napoleon went as far as to take over the Vatican, and at that point, the Pope was imprisoned by Napoleon, and while he was in prison, he was forced to reinstate the Jesuits, and that's how the Jesuits came back into power. And that's also how the Jesuits became in a position above the Vatican. Like you were saying before, Dank, like that, the Black Pope is above the White Pope. Well, that's how it is now. Like since the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon took the Pope hostage and forced him into this position. Boom. Yeah. I was like, whoa. Like I never knew that. I didn't know that Napoleonic Wars ended with like the Pope being imprisoned and like forced to give the Jesuits their power back. But so then at this point, Europe becomes really like cohesively controlled by this power structure. And, there's, I wouldn't say peace in Europe because then you get into the world wars, but Europe becomes a little more united in like a mission to take back America. And that's what's called the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance of 1822 is part of these treaties that ended the Napoleonic Wars. There was like I think it's called the Congress of Verona, in which the Jesuits allied with the European monarchies with the mission to take back America, like within this power structure. And so at this point, the map sort of jumps into a more like concrete timeline on that lower left. After you have like that Holy Alliance happen, like there's a little infiltration of USA left side of page. So then you jump over to like below like L'Enfant Plan, and you see like infiltration of USA. And then it goes through like, so like this is when like the events are very firmly established. I actually got a lot of this timeline from that Pepe meme. Let me see if I can drop it in for you because it was a really good way to show this timeline. Yeah, here it is. Ready? Sorry, wait, I dropped it in the wrong program. 1 second. There it is. So actually, I had already been following most of this timeline in my own research, but when I saw this meme, I was like, oh my God, it's like the exact timeline I was doing, except with even more bullet points in there. So it shows you how after that Holy Alliance in 1822, America starts having like even more problems. I mean, they had already had the War of 1812 was like the first attempt to like take America back, like for England. And then, after 1822, you start seeing more of a struggle to control the main bank in America. And so there was like a first national bank, which was sort of founded by Alexander Hamilton. And these national banks is like what the Illuminati, these bankers want, is like they want to have a national bank in every country, and then they want to have like a global bank so that they can control everyone's finance. So, I mean, America's whole history, pretty much before the Federal Reserve, can be seen as this struggle to form like a national bank that's controlled by this global power structure, which is sort of has the Rothschilds at its head, but really has like the Vatican at its head. So you see like we had a first national bank, And the first two banks we had 20-year charters. And after that 20-year charter was up, like the bank was created as a response to a war to pay off debt. And then after the 20 years was up, the bank's supposed to expire. And all like the patriots in America were like really happy when these banks would expire and like did not want another one. But then like the globalist bankers would come in and be like, you need a new bank. And so they would start a new war with us so that we'd have debt again. And so that's basically the history of our country is, you know, after the War of 1812, we had to create the second national bank to pay for like the debt from that. And then after that charter expires, lo and behold, we have the Civil War. And so it's pretty clear. I'm not completely sure how or like through what exact means, but it's pretty clear to me that the Civil War was mainly about this bank trying to like get into our country.
Bro, you know what that war was about? Big shout out to In the Matrix. He's the one that first put us onto pesos, and Q ended up confirming pesos. That they are basically kind of like Rothschilds, like an extension of them, like almost like a JP Morgan type thing. And these pesos, they changed one of their names of their descendants to Springs, and that's who gave birth to Abe Lincoln. Boom, Abe Lincoln's actually a pesos, and it was over. It wasn't even about slaves, bro. It was about pesos and Rothschilds.
Yeah,
pesos were north and Rothschilds were south.
Wow, thank you. I should probably add pesos to this map at some point, like connected to Abe Lincoln, because yeah, it was more of a war between banks than slaves.
Ready for some more knowledge? Dude,
Yeah,
this is great shit. The pesos, so they control just about all the assets in America. They control the United States of America. What's the actual name of the corporation? Because they created the corporation and they bought it with the was it the Carolina? No, the Virginia Company. Boom.
Oh, okay.
Yep, they own the Virginia Company, the railroads, and they used the Virginia Company to buy out the country when it was turned into a corporation.
Yes, well, you've definitely filled in some bullet points for me there. Like, I think those would be good ones to add surrounding the U.S. Civil War, which, you know, ended with Lincoln being assassinated. And there is evidence that Lincoln was assassinated by Jesuits because after he was assassinated, the U.S. cut their ties with the Vatican. And it was because there was so much like anti-Vatican sentiment from having our president assassinated by what, you know, insiders thought was the Jesuits. So after he's out of the way, I guess, so he would be backed by the pesos, and then it's like the way is basically cleared for the Rothschilds to move in. And then you see the Act of 1871, which changed the United States from, I guess you would call it like a republic, into a corporation. And I think probably then like that corporation would be like kind of in a way under the ownership of the Queen of England. And just basically after that, like things have fallen into line for them to establish the Federal Reserve. The last thing they had to do before they could establish the Federal Reserve was kill off the industrialists that opposed it, which is why they sunk the Titanic, killed off, I think, like Astor and like a few other of these like really important industrialists who opposed the Federal Reserve. And so after that happened in 1912, the way was completely clear for the actual Federal Reserve to be established. So that's 1913. And that's actually when this timeline originally ended, was with that establishment of the Federal Reserve. Because like at that point, it was like USA was under the control of this power structure and that everything was in place for the whole 20th century to unfold. And, you know, both these World War I and World War II were necessary wars or even necessary power struggles, but that's just how this power structure like enriches itself even more and consolidates even more resources for itself. And they get the added benefit of all these human sacrifices, which are basically sacrificed to Baal. Even in war, you know, they don't care about human life. Like that's their pleasure is to sacrifice these people, and they get a sick pleasure out of it because, you know, in their private life they're sacrificing children and drinking the blood anyway. So that pretty much takes us through. I mean, I basically filled in more points to just like fill up the rest of the map, but that's like the main gist that I wanted to get across. I mean, I've added in Bilderberg. Bilderberg is sort of like the modern. I think pretty much everyone following QAnon knows what Bilderberg is at this point. But I think like what I've read is that Bilderberg is sort of like the modern front for the Illuminati. And so that's clearly like an organization that is controlling world affairs, like from a global standpoint, that's like completely infiltrated by the Illuminati, the Freemasons.
Yeah, it's created by them. It's basically just like the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission.
Yeah, I didn't want to get into too much of like the 20th century like power structure on this map because it originally ended with the Federal Reserve, but then, like I said, I just filled in this space with, more points that just confirm the thesis, confirm that there is like this shadow government or whatever, a global government that's run out of Switzerland, controlling the USA and controlling the whole world. And hopefully that's what we're defeating with QAnon. When QAnon talks about, these people are sick, a cult controls the world. I actually just did a meme of QAnon saying that. Where did it go? Well, here's the original.
If you want to take go.
Yeah, when QAnon said the cult runs the world, Fantasyland, the world is fighting back, destroying the cult. I mean, that's pretty much the gist of that post. That's why I saved it and shared it, because that's kind of like what this map is a proof of, that a cult does run the world. That is this ancient cult of Baal, or pharaonic death cult. That's what Q is referring to, and it's even more proof. I don't know. I think I've already talked to you guys about this, but that they just had that cult of Arch of Baal is on like a traveling tour and just went through DC. And so this thing has been touring since before Trump came into power. Like it was in New York in 2016. And it's basically a recreation, a marble 3D printing of, hold on, let me just find it to drop it in here.
When after you're done with that, if you want to take a look at the folder underneath the boom room questions and see a couple that you might not have answered yet and try to answer those, that might be a good way to finish out too.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I just wanted to show like the picture / meme I did of this Arch of Baal that they've been toting through the world. Like it's been in London, it's been in New York, and now just like 2 weeks ago, it was in DC on the National Mall. And this is a 3D printing of the Temple of Baal from, I guess it was in Syria, that they are just touring around the world and like acting like they just want to like preserve this historical artifact when it has complete significance to like their true religion of these elites who are Satanists, like Baal worshippers, whatever you want to call it.
What's the missing keystone?
Yeah, there's a missing keystone. There's probably some kind of like satanic like bust like hanging out of there. But for me, like seeing this Arch of Baal like in Washington DC, like right when I'm like finishing this map and getting ready to release the posters and like lining up interviews, I was just like, how is this? It's like almost too coincidence to be possible that they're putting like on display like the most obvious example of the fact that they really are the cult of Baal, like by putting this right in the middle of DC with like the Capitol like framed beneath it. It's just like, come on, guys, like can you make it more obvious?
And that's something we like to call synchronicity.
Yeah, like a major synchronicity.
Boom. So we do have a few questions for you. Do you agree that Baal, Baphomet, Satan, Lucifer, and other names all refer to one demonic entity? Or how do you see it? Why so many names?
Well, I definitely think that like Lucifer and Satan refer to two different entities, and that also even Baphomet is sort of a different entity. There's actually a separate little, what do you call it? Like archetype for the Baphomet, which there was a Egyptian one that was like the goat of Mendes that had a similar name that started with a B. Hold on, let me just pull it up for myself.
No.
I need to look at it myself too, because I just finished this part of the DD chart before I before I uploaded the poster. So it's kind of new to me as well. And I just discovered that the Greek deity Pan, like while I was in Greece, I was like seeing their little Greek like souvenirs and stuff of this thing that looked like the devil. I mean, it's like a little man with like goat feet, and he has horns, and he has a giant penis sticking up, even in these little souvenirs that little statues and stuff. So I was like, who the fuck is Pan with this huge penis? I was like, this is like the devil. But yeah, like, I mean, it looked like the devil, but he wasn't like didn't have such a negative connotation in the Greek culture. I mean, I don't exactly know like what he represented. They had a lot of gods, but he wasn't like the devil archetype. But it's like clearly that this is like the origin of Baphomet. And there was also, this Egyptian god. I'm not even going to try to say his name. Baned B'Jibmet. I think his name is also the goat of Mendes, because Mendes is like an Egyptian thing that was also sort of the origin of Baphomet. So, I mean, Baphomet's definitely like more of like a male deity, but he's not the same as the storm god. That's what I'm saying. He's more of like I think more of like either like a pleasure, or like, I'm totally guessing, but he's not like the typical storm god. So yeah, to answer that question, I would say no. I would say, Satan is more like the sky storm god. Baphomet's like a different male archetype that's associated with slightly different things. And that Lucifer is more of the feminine archetype and is associated with more of like the earth and Venus.
Boom. How do you reconcile that from the Gnostics to present day Protestants, that they're Christians and yet Satanists?
Let me see. How do you reconcile that from the Gnostics to present day Protestants, that they are Christians and yet they are Satanism?
I think this is going back up to the top of how do the present day living Rothschilds fit in? Was their role today in relationships to the Clintons and Hillary a witch, or is she just Because then she said the same question.
I would say definitely a witch. I think they have an important role, but they're not the rulers of the world. They've been given a role to play, and I think this is like a free will universe, like I said, or like most of us know or have heard in like the metaphysical discussions. This is a free will universe. 5D definitely talks about that. So like the Rothschilds, they could probably throw a wrench in the system if they wanted to, because they do have a lot of power. But they also have people they report to. So they probably have the autonomy to make some moves. Like they may do a power grab against one group or another, but they're not at the top of the power structure, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I definitely think there's a shadow group that's pulling the strings behind them, and they're just kind of the public name, because there's, like I said, Pesurs, which have a lot more power. And I think this is something Q was referring to, where he says, the internet and stuff has hurt their ability of control and their ability to hide. And that groups like that are really the ones that were in power behind these Rothschild groups. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, even in that like Civil War, if you were saying like the Pesurs were behind the Lincolns and like they were fighting the Rothschilds, which were behind the South, I think it's probably more of a situation where like both these banks are working together to like have their war, have their human sacrifice, and gain more control, like a deeper control over the whole territory of the United States. So yeah, that totally makes sense.
And then one more question is, can you elaborate on 1776 and George Washington being aware of the Illuminati plan, the design of Washington, D.C. covertly?
So this is something I'm a little bit still like unclear on. I mean, I do think that our founding fathers had good intentions, even the ones that were Freemasons. And, clearly I sort of skipped over this, but like the L'Enfant plan is like the street layout of Washington, D.C. that a man whose last name was L'Enfant came up with. Now, I know like nowadays we might see some ties between him and James Alefantis with like the Pizzagate thing. He's calling his names like l'enfant, which means like the baby. So that's a little bit creepy that, you know, someone whose name is like the baby created like the floor layout of Washington, D.C., or the street layout. But I just haven't seen like that much evidence. I mean, in the George Washington Memorial, it did say that he had only been in a lodge like maybe like 2 or 3 times in his whole life. So I think his involvement with Freemasonry has been exaggerated a lot posthumously. But you know, there may have been some founding fathers that were like Illuminati Freemasons, and there may have been other founding fathers that were just regular Freemasons. So, I mean, I think a lot of us have heard, you know, there was a certain percentage of founding fathers who were Freemasons, but no, I don't think anyone's really heard like an accurate number of how many founding fathers were really Illuminati or not. You know, I've heard some other rumors about Benjamin Franklin that like a bunch of bodies were discovered in his house when he lived in England for a while. So there's definitely some signs that there may have been corruption early on. And like Alexander Hamilton, for one, is the one who first sold out the USA to establish the first national bank. So clearly Alexander Hamilton was either Illuminati or working for the Illuminati at that point. And so it's kind of ironic now that New York has this big Broadway production now, like praising Alexander Hamilton and having everyone worship him, when he was really like the first early American that really like hardcore sold out our country to these globalist bankers. So that's ironic that that play is going on and that all these New Yorkers are like obsessed with him and think he's like a cool like rap star now. But yeah, so definitely I think there's definitely enough evidence, like just from our Constitution, the way it's written, that a lot of these founding fathers did have good intentions at heart and like we're not part of this like satanic cult, but that there was infiltration even from the beginning to some extent.
Boom.
Boom.
Bro, you killed it. So give them your information so they can figure out how to follow you on Instagram, Twitter, you know, your website.
Yeah, definitely. So my website is deepstatemappingproject.com. Maybe we could like pull it up in the screen share just to show people. I just released actually yesterday the Cult of Baal poster. So that's really exciting. I think a lot of people are really anticipating it because some people had heard me on Leak Project talk about it, and you know, people have seen the Sephiroth map since April. And so now I have posters for the Cult of Baal and for the Sephiroth, and they both look pretty badass. You know, the Cult of Baal map definitely is intended to be as a poster because the font is so small, it's even smaller than the QWeb, that I always intended it to be like a 36 by 24 poster. So that's really like the way it's intended to be like read. And the Sephiroth map just looks great. It's like black and red. So yeah, check out deepstatemappingproject.com, and then in the info section of Deep State Mapping Project, which is part of the navigation bar, the info, you can look at the individual web pages I've made for the Cult of Baal and the Sephiroth and look at the other images and research I've done. And then of course, my main meme sharing and sharing platform is Instagram, where my username is Master Conspiracy, based on the Comedy Central skit that was trying to like make a mockery of the QWeb. So Master Conspiracy on Instagram, and then on Facebook, I have a Deep State Mapping Project group that I would love everyone to join to be part of the discussion and share articles, share information in that group, Deep State Mapping Project, the group. So just join, you'll be approved. And I think that's about it.
Yep. So not only is he a fabulous map maker, but he also is a great graphics artist. Comes up with dank memes all the time. So make sure you want to catch those too, and follow him on those different platforms. Pick up posters; they're fabulous, and check out his websites. He has a lot of information, documented sources, and stuff. And Dylan's just a great guy. We love having him here on ConspiracyFact.press. Thanks again for being here with us, and love the interview, bro. Thanks for joining us again. We'll see you here soon, especially if you come up with another map. So see you soon, bro.
Just want to give a shout out to conspiracyfact.press. You guys are really getting a great catalog of interviews going on your channel. And I just want to point out to people that anyone who has not listened to the 5D interviews we did, like go back and listen to those, because those were really great. The interviews with 5D Awakening Consciousness, I feel like they're kind of like hidden gems on YouTube right now. Like not enough people have seen those or heard the Great Awakening map explained. So after you get through this one and you're all depressed and you think there's a bunch of Satanists ruling the world, like go look at the Great Awakening map and you will see the positive timeline in our future in which we take back the world from these Satanists and build a better one.
Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Click the notification bell to get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Check out the other platforms we're on, including Patreon, where you can leave a monthly donation, or PayPal, where you can just make a one-time donation if you like the channel and you'd like to help support us. Boom!